Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Personalised Medical Devices webinar. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we're meeting today. For those of us in Canberra, that's the Ngunnawal people. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Thank you for joining me. My name is Beck Bateson. I'm an Assistant Director here at the TGA in the Devices, Emerging Technology and Diagnostic section. Currently, I'm the project lead for the introduction of the Personalised Medical Devices framework, and today we're going to be providing you with an overview and a bit of a discussion about the impact of some of the changes. Today, we're predominantly talking about changes to the regulation of custom-made medical devices. Under the current regulations, custom-made medical devices are exempt from a requirement to be included in the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods before they're imported or supplied. Now, I'd like to stress that being exempt from inclusion in the register doesn't mean that they are exempt from regulation. There are actually a number of existing regulatory requirements for custom-made medical devices that you do need to meet. Now, the main reason these devices were exempt from the requirement to be included in the register is because in 2002, when the regulations came into effect, custom-made medical devices were predominantly very low risk. We were talking about products like splints, dentures and aligners in the dental industry, orthotics and prosthetics. Since 2002, we've seen some rapid advances and improvements in technology, and the devices that are now being designed and manufactured to suit specific individuals include devices such as orthopaedic implants. That means that if you need a hip replacement, we can take a scan of your existing hip and 3D print a patient-matched hip implant in titanium. Under the current regulations, those kinds of devices are exempt from inclusion in the ARTG and can be supplied without any independent oversight. Now, this is a global issue. Medical device regulators around the world are moving to address the challenge of appropriately regulating these kinds of devices. Here at the TGA, we're involved with work in the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, and we've conducted public consultation about this issue over a couple of years. As a result, the Australian Government has agreed to the introduction of a new framework for the regulations of these kinds of devices. Collectively, those changes are called the Personalised Medical Devices Framework, and it commences on the 25th of February this year. So this is an overview of the changes with respect to custom-made medical devices. On the left there, you can see the current regulatory situation and the impact of the changes that we're making to custom-made medical devices on the right. At the bottom, you can see adaptable medical devices. The way these devices are regulated is not changing. I'll explain a little bit more about those a bit further on and why we've included them. The primary change is we've taken custom-made medical devices and we've reduced the scope of products that will continue to meet the definition by introducing new concepts. That's patient-matched medical devices and medical devices produced using a medical device production system. Let's start by talking about custom-made medical devices. So there will still be a definition for custom-made. Devices that meet that definition will continue to be exempt from the requirement to include in the register before they're imported or supplied, but the devices that meet the new definition of a patient-matched device and devices that meet the definition of an adaptable device, which is a new definition for an existing concept, will no longer be included in the definition of a custom-made medical device. The impact of this change, as you can see in the graphic at the bottom right there, is that the pool of devices that will continue to meet the definition of custom-made will be dramatically reduced. In practical terms, very few devices are going to meet the new definition of custom-made that has been introduced. For those that do continue to meet the definition, there are new obligations in addition to the existing obligations for those kinds of devices. If you supply a custom-made medical device, you will need to supply it with specific information. You will need to keep records about what you supplied and to whom. That's for 5 years if the device is non-implantable, 15 years if it is implantable. You will also be required to submit an annual report to the TGA, and you will need to allow access to your premises for inspection and review if you are requested. On this page, we have an overview of the timeframes for the new requirements. So you have until August this year to register for transition, and the 1st of November 2024 to include your device in the register if you're supplying a custom-made medical device or a patient-matched device that is transitioning from the 25th of February. Now, if you are transitioning, you will need to meet new regulatory obligations from the 25th of February. That means you will need to submit an annual report relating to all the devices you manufactured or supplied between the 25th of February and 30th of June this year by the 1st of October. Let's talk about where the majority of custom-made medical devices will land under the new framework, and that's within the definition of patient-matched. If you're producing a medical device that is designed and manufactured to fit a specific individual within a design envelope, and you're using production processes that can be validated, verified or reproduced, your device is going to meet the definition of a patient-matched. Now, I know that those terms I've just used are very familiar to engineers and that they're less familiar to some of you, so let's just take a moment to explain what they mean in layman's terms. The specified design envelope is the limits of design that you are confident and can provide objective evidence for will result in a medical device that is safe and will meet an individual patient's requirement. So that could include factors like physical limitations, measurements, it will include the raw materials that you're using, it will include the processes that you're using for manufacturing the device. In short, if you know that what you're doing will work, it's likely you're working within a design envelope with production processes that can be validated, verified and reproduced. If you've never done it before and you're unlikely to do it again, then it's likely that it's still custom made. If your devices fall within this definition, you need to notify us by the 25th of August this year that you're going to access the transition arrangements, and you will need to submit an application for inclusion in the register by the 1st of November 2024. The impact of including a patient-matched device in the register is that you will have the same regulatory requirements as any other device. To give you a visual representation of the timeline from the 25th of February this year, if you supply a new device to the market that you haven't supplied prior to that date, you will need to include it in the ARTG. Existing devices will need to commence transitioning to inclusion in the register. That process will include acquiring appropriate evidence of conformity assessment, including certification, and submitting an application for inclusion before the 1st of November 2024. Now we get to a really interesting part of the framework, medical device production systems. This is a brand new concept. We are the first in the world to introduce it. In short, a medical device production system is an end-to-end system for the manufacture of patient-matched medical devices that is supplied to healthcare facilities so they can produce the devices in-house. First thing I need to say about this is that this facility is coming soon. The definition will commence in the regs on the 25th of February. We've brought that in as part of the framework, but you won't be able to include a system in the ARTG until we sign a legislative instrument to declare them to be a medical device. So there is still work to be done with the International Medical Device Regulators Forum to determine how we're going to validate and verify these systems to ensure the devices they produce are safe and fit for their intended purpose. We're going to need to change our internal processes to allow us to appropriately evaluate these systems, and we're expecting that work will be completed in 18 months to 2 years, which is well before the date when the transition period ends. So with that caveat out of the way, let's have a bit of a discussion about how it will work. First of all, you will need to include the system in the ARTG. Second, it will be classified at the same level as the device it's designed to manufacture. So if it's manufacturing a Class 1 non-sterile, non-measuring splint in the dental industry, the medical device production system will be included as a Class 1 non-sterile, non-measuring. If it's used to manufacture a Class 3 craniofacial implant in a hospital, it's going to be included as a Class 3 medical device production system in the register. The critical point here is that when a medical device production system that is included in the register is used by a healthcare professional or another suitable qualified person within a healthcare facility, the devices that are manufactured will be subject to a conditional exemption. And what that means is that the person using the system will not need to meet all of the regulatory obligations that a manufacturer would ordinarily meet, providing they use the system to produce devices in accordance with the intended purpose of the system. They do it in accordance with the instructions for use provided by the manufacturer, and they do it in accordance with the conditions of the exemption. So we are still working through those conditions. Those conditions are likely to be requirements such as mandatory reporting of adverse events and record keeping. The key aspect here is that the system can be used to manufacture a patient-matched device, and the device itself will not need to be included in the ARTG. That brings me to the final point. The system will need to be supplied in such a manner that the person using it can produce a medical device that is safe and fit for its intended purpose. At a minimum, we will need to see comprehensive instructions supplied with the device, and with higher risk devices, those measures might include a requirement to complete a dedicated training course with the supplier of the system before it can be used, and safety measures such as encryption access that limits the use of the system to the kinds of devices the individual is trained to manufacture. So what we're talking about there, if we had a craniofacial implant system in a hospital and a surgeon had been trained to use the system, they would have encrypted access. They'd be able to use it to produce any kind of craniofacial implant, but they wouldn't be able to use it to produce another device like a rib or a hip. Now, as I mentioned, these systems will not be a facility available to you for a year or two, and for those of you using systems that meet the definition of a medical device production system that will eventually be included in the ARTG, we suggest that you register the devices you're currently manufacturing for transition to allow you to continue to legally supply them until the medical device production system facility becomes available. Now, we will be producing more information as we develop it, so please keep your eye out for that. All right, let's talk about adaptable medical devices. I touched on this right back at the start. Adaptable medical devices is a new definition for an existing concept. Adaptable medical devices are devices that are intended to be modified at the point of care to suit the individual in question. These devices have always required inclusion in the ARTG and should always have been supplied with instructions for use to allow them to be safely modified at the point of care. The definition has been added to the regulations for the sake of clarity, and we've also updated the essential principles to explicitly state that they must be supplied with instructions to allow safe modification or assembly at the point of care. The final aspect of the new framework is the reclassification of some medical devices, including diagnostic images and anatomical models. Any devices that meet this description will be reclassified to Class 2A. That is, unless they're already classified at a higher level. So if a device that meets this definition is already included in the ARTG as a Class 2B, it will continue to be a Class 2B. First up are devices that are used to record patient images for diagnosis or monitoring of a disease, injury or disability, or the investigation of a physiological process. And there are two components there. One, they must meet the definition of a medical device, and two, the images must be acquired through a method that relies on energy outside the visible spectrum. Second are anatomical models, and again, I need to stress that they must meet the definition of a medical device in order for these rules to apply. Educational models that are used in a GP surgery to show someone what their reproductive system looks like are not used to diagnose and or monitor a disease, injury or disability or investigate a physiological process. However, if a surgeon 3D printed an anatomical model using CT data from a patient's spine to aid with diagnosis and to do post-surgical planning, that would meet the definition of a medical device. Finally, we have software-based devices that are used to generate a virtual anatomical model. As above, these products need to meet the definition of a medical device before they can be impacted by the classification rule. Now, one of the questions that we're frequently getting about these products is, if the software-based device is included in the ARTG, must you also include the virtual model it produces? And the answer is no, providing the software manufacturer intended for you to use their software for this purpose. If you are using ARTG-included software to produce a virtual model in accordance with the instructions for use that you got from the manufacturer, the virtual model itself will not need to be included in the ARTG. All right, that concludes our brief overview of the framework. Before we commence the questions, I would like to point out some important dates and some things that you need to do. First of all, please read the guidance. I know it's an extensive document, but we've worked hard with members of industry in various sectors to give you a good overview and some practical examples of how the new framework will apply. We will also be updating the guidance with new versions as we refine the information, and we will be producing more resources to support you. Other educational material, including fact sheets, will be produced, and particularly if you are transitioning a device to inclusion in the ARTG. Second, if you haven't already, please take the stakeholder survey to tell us what industry you're from and which areas of framework you will need more information about. We will use your contact information to make sure that we get you the information that you need as it becomes available. If you need to include your patient matched in the ARTG or you need to reclassify your devices at a higher level, please register for transition before the 25th of August this year. If you don't register for transition, you will need to cease supply until you have an inclusion in the register after this date. If you are supplying a custom-made medical device or transitioning one to patient match, you need to submit your first annual report by the 1st of October this year. We're in the process of designing an online form to make this an easy process for you, and if you have submitted a custom-made medical device or transition notification, we will send you information about how to submit your report in June. Finally, please submit your application for inclusion in the register or reclassification by the 1st of November 2024. With higher risk devices, the application may not be complete by that date, but the application does need to be in place before then. Okay folks, as mentioned, we will be producing more information and guidance to help you over the coming months. My team and I have taken the liberty of taking contact details that are available online. We are also cold calling in person those businesses and those healthcare providers that we cannot find email addresses for. Please don't hang up on us, we are not scammers. We will also be working with a number of industry groups to produce dedicated content for each sector, including webinars that will focus on specific questions relating to your sector. So we have some coming up with ADIA, ADA and AOPA. If you do need more help, you can find it through SME Assist. SME Assist is a dedicated service that the TGA offers to help small to medium enterprises, startups and researchers who are developing new medicines and medical devices to understand their regulatory and legislative obligations. The SME team runs workshops in major cities around Australia which cover the basics of regulation, market authorisation, manufacturing, advertising and post-market monitoring. They do live stream and record their workshops, and they also have pre-recordings of workshop topics available. You can find all of these on the SME Assist hub of the TGA website. Those resources are going to be particularly useful for those of you transitioning to inclusion in the register if you've never included advice in the register before, and I really encourage you to make use of them. We also encourage you to subscribe to our SME Assist email list to stay up to date with the latest SME information, including upcoming workshops, new guidance and webinars. You can also contact the SME Assist team via the details shown on this slide. So I'd like to thank you for bearing with me through that overview. I'm going to hand you over to Rachel, and then we are going to come back after we've had a chance to look at some of the questions that you've sent through. And if you are still sending those through, we will collate them and try to get a bit of a narrative happening to address them. Okay, we've had a chance to look at the questions. I've just scrolled through them, and there are some repeating themes here, so I'm just going to address them, not necessarily the direct questions themselves, but I'm going to talk about them in categories. So we're getting a lot of questions about medical device production systems. So as I said, that's a facility that the definition will commence on the 25th of February, but it won't be available until we declare them to be medical devices. The International Medical Device Regulators Forum does have a working group that is meeting at the moment in order to develop information and guidance about how we're going to validate and verify those kinds of systems. And the TGA needs to make sure that we harmonise with that advice and guidance. So it is 18 months to 2 years until they come in place. If you are using those systems at the moment, basically it's not a defined concept that you're using, you are just producing patient-matched medical devices in-house. So we do suggest that you register for transition, which means that you continue to use them until we do bring in the facility. So you will need to make sure that you meet the same deadline as everybody else does for patient matched. There's a lot of questions there about confirming the deadlines. So with respect to the 25th of February, that's when the new framework drops. With custom-made medical devices, it is an existing regulatory requirement that you need to notify the TGA within 2 months that you are manufacturing or supplying those devices. So that notification should be submitted to the TGA. The transition notification is separate. That's a notification that you specifically need to move from custom made to patient matched, and you need to do that by the 25th of August. So as I said in the presentation, if you are transitioning from custom made to patient matched after the 25th of February, you will need to meet the new regulatory requirements for custom made medical devices, and you will need to submit an annual report by the 1st of October this year. So we're also seeing a lot of generalised questions about general regulatory concepts. So I'm just going to touch on those a little bit now. There are two bodies that we really look at, two entities when we're looking at the regulation of medical devices. The first is the manufacturer. That's the person that's manufacturing the device. Now, whether they're in Australia or whether they're overseas, they need to basically ensure that their medical device meets the essential principles, and they need to provide a declaration of conformity and conformity assessment evidence to support the inclusion of that device into the ARTG. The second entity is the sponsor. The sponsor is the Australian-based legal entity that is responsible for the supply of the device in Australia. They might be importing it, they might be making it themselves and supplying it. So if you're a healthcare professional and you are buying your devices from somebody who has already included it in the ARTG, you won't need to do anything else. If you are importing it from overseas, then you are the person that is going to need to include it in the ARTG. An inclusion in the register is for a kind of medical device, and there is some guidance on our website. If you jump to our website and you type in medical device inclusion process, you will get a step-by-step walkthrough of how to include a device in the register. So one of the questions that we received was, if there's a number of different kinds being produced for specific individual patients, how many times do I have to include it in the register? You only need to include it once. So your inclusion in the register is for a kind of medical device, providing that it has particular qualities such as the same manufacturer, same sponsor, same classification, and same GMDN code. That's one inclusion in the ARTG to cover all those devices. All right, so we have some questions about transition. Registering by the transition date, the 25th of August, and what do you need to register for transition? As I just said, with the kind of medical device, you will need to provide a transition notification for each kind of device that you supply. So if you're in the dental industry and you're supplying splints, that will probably be one transition notification. If you have dentures, that will be a second transition notification. Okay, one of the questions that we've had is how to get confirmation and more advice and information. So we do have a hotline. We have the Medical Devices Information Unit here at the TGA, and we are asking inquiries to be sent through to devices@tga.gov.au. That's because a lot of the questions that we're receiving relate to general regulatory questions. How do I include my device? What's the kind of device? The information unit will be escalating anything that relates to the framework to the Personalised Medical Devices team. So if you have any questions, please come through devices@tga.gov.au. As I mentioned earlier, we have done a mass mail out to the email addresses that we could find. That was almost 10,000 people that we contacted in person. We will keep that master contact list and continue to provide information, probably about one email a month until people hit the unsubscribe button. If you would like to join that mailing list, please forward your email address to devices@tga.gov.au or use the stakeholder survey. There are links to the transition notification area in the guidance that's on the website. It's also included in the direct mail outs that we're sending out. Okay, I think that covers just about everything that we have been asked. As I mentioned before, we will continue to produce more educational materials and resources. We will be doing dedicated webinars with different peak industry groups. So if you belong to a peak industry group, it might be worth touching base with them, reading their newsletter to see the information that's included about upcoming dedicated webinars with them. As I said, you can come through the Devices Information Unit and we will provide you with more information through those channels. So again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and hopefully we will be able to hear from you soon.